Hello everyone, so this is where I'm going to explain the assignment for major project number one. So you've got this document in the folder, but I'm going to go through and explain exactly what it is. Realize that you will not just have to jump in and begin writing this assignment. You've got some stages to go through, as you'll be able to see in Blackboard. But you need to know what the assignment is. The first thing you'll need to do is do a brainstorming assignment, brainstorming discussion board, and then you're going to write an outline. But we want to make sure we understand what the actual assignment is before we begin those. So major project number one. So for project number one, you're to write about the metaphorical language in any one, only one, choose one of the following poems. Persimmons, Dothead, Of the Threads That Connect the Stars, or What It's Like to Be a Black Girl for those of you who aren't. So you're just going to choose one of those, and you're specifically going to talk about the metaphorical language. Next, your project should begin with a clear thesis. So it's important to think about what a thesis is. A thesis is the big idea that you want to get across. It is your perception about what's really going to be happening here. We can say, again, that a thesis is, again, what the topic of your essay is, but more importantly, on some level, it is your idea about how to think about the poem. What is your perception about what's really going on? And that's really important because you've got to have your particular point that you're making. A lot of times students will say, well, is this the right thing, the wrong thing? The question is, what is your idea, and can you support your idea? Because as I've mentioned before, that sense of being able to prove a particular idea is going to be one of the most important skills that we can have, right? Can we come up with an idea and know that idea makes some sense? That's the basis of critical thinking. That's on some level how you decide to do anything that's important. Is I have an idea. How do I weigh the evidence to tell me whether or not that idea is going to be good? I mean, should I move from one apartment to another? Should I move to another city? Should I take this job or that job? We weigh the evidence in order to be able to understand what we're supposed to do there. And here we've got something that's maybe a little bit more complicated and intricate, but it's still going to follow those same principles. I've got an idea, and I've just got to be able to have the evidence that's going to be able to support that. So I say here, your project should begin with a clear thesis. That is, at the beginning of your project, you must clearly state what you want to prove, right? And that's important, that it's what you are trying to prove. You've got an idea, and you've got to prove that idea is true. So using the Latin Deli as an example, and as I say, you cannot write about the Latin Deli. I'm just using an example, so I'm not providing you with a thesis for your actual project. A possible thesis could be, in the Latin Deli, Judith Ortiz Cofer uses metaphorical language to show us how even though immigrants willingly come to the United States, they can still feel a deep longing for the places they have left. Right? So that could be a thesis for that. Notice that it mentions how we're going to have metaphorical language in there. And as I say in here, the second bolded part of the sentence is vital to your thesis. You must discuss exactly what the metaphorical language is telling us. So you have to mention metaphorical language. If your thesis does not mention metaphorical language, that's a big problem, because this is an essay about metaphorical language, and you better mention that in your thesis because that's what you're going to talk about. Excuse me, but even more, but also equally importantly, rather, is to say, what is it that we're supposed to be learning from that metaphorical language, right? In this case, it tells us how, as it says here in bold, even though immigrants willingly come to the United States, they can still feel a deep longing for the places they have left. So it's kind of like what the big idea of the poem is. And so you're going to do the same thing for the other poems. What is the big idea in Persimmons? What does Lee want to get across? What is the big idea in Dothead? What's the big idea in the other poems that you could potentially be looking at? So you've got to mention specific metaphorical language, and you have to tell us what that metaphorical language is doing. Okay, and as I say here, you must be specific in the second part. So for the Latin Deli, you could not. This is a bad example, an example of something not to do. You could not say, in the Latin Deli, Judith Ortiz Cofer uses metaphorical language to show us how many immigrants feel. Notice that the first one tells us specifically about the conflicts many immigrants feel about losing their homes. That is, even though they willingly came to the United States, they can still feel a deep longing for the place that they have left. But this other one that I have here simply says it shows us how they feel. That's general. I don't know what that is. So you want to try and be much more specific. Do something similar to this. And so try and tell us what you're supposed to, what exactly you want to discuss. A lot of times students don't want to be specific in their theses because sometimes they feel like, well, if I'm too specific in my thesis, then what am I going to talk about for the rest of my essay? But realize that what you're doing for the rest of your essay is proving your thesis, providing evidence that's going to back that up. So you want to try and be specific about what it is specifically you're going to be proving. So that's why this is going to be the better idea for the better model for what you can do for a thesis. So then you have to use specific quotes from the text to back up your ideas. That is, you need to show us exactly what the metaphors say. So instead of saying Cofer shows us that the old man is homesick, I mean that's true, maybe true. We can see that happening in the poem, but where exactly do you see it? So you could, instead of saying that, you could write, when Cofer writes about the hunger of the fragile old man, she's using hunger as a metaphor to show us how deeply the old man misses home. And see, what I'm doing is I'm showing you how the metaphor actually operates. What is it we're able to learn from that metaphor of hunger? Hunger is not the literal hunger. It's not like this old man's got a pit in his stomach and just needs to eat something. He is hungering for something else, right? And so the hunger is a metaphor to show us how much he misses home, right? Because the plain ham and cheese won't satisfy that hunger. He needs to go to the Latin deli where he can experience something that it seems familiar to him, something related to his home, and then that hunger is going to be satisfied. So I'm explaining here specifically how the hunger is going to be a metaphor to help us understand how the old man feels. And realize, of course, this idea that I have down here about hunger as a metaphor, it relates back to the thesis. Even though immigrants willingly came to the United States, they can still feel a deep longing for the places they had left. Well, where do you have metaphors that tell us something about that? Well, this hunger from the old man is a metaphor that shows us how much he misses home. He came here willingly, but he's still going to miss his home. Okay, now I'm seeing how this all is going to relate. So you should also use any other relevant vocabulary to help make your ideas as clear as possible. So, for example, you could say, when Cofer writes about the list of items that the old man reads to her like poetry, the connotations of the word poetry suggest that the old man's grocery list is more beautiful and emotional than we usually think a grocery list could be. So connotations are going to be ideas that are going to be associated with a word, right? And so poetry is not just this thing that we write on the page. It suggests something beautiful. It suggests something potentially spiritual or romantic. It goes beyond something that's very plain and simple. And so the connotations of that word poetry help us understand what the larger ideas here are. So this project needs to be 3 pages long in an MLA format. When you get to the folder that explains the rough draft, in that folder I'll explain exactly what MLA format is, so don't worry about that yet. When you get to that stage, it will all make some sense. And then, as I say here, please note that any project with a similarity score of greater than 35% on Turnitin will not be graded. So either your rough draft or your outline, if it is not your outline, your rough draft or your final draft, if it has a score greater than 35% on Turnitin, it will not be graded. There is on Turnitin, there's a series of numbers over on the right-hand side, and one of those numbers is going to list how similar your writing is to other writing that it is found, that other students have submitted, or it's found on the internet. Your number should not be 0 because you're going to be using quotes. And those quotes will show up, right? And so you're going to definitely have some quotes that are going to, if you're going to have some quotes, you're going to have a certain amount of overlap between your work and somebody else's work. So I just don't want it to go over 35% because that means you've got way too many quotes in there, okay? Or it means that you are copying somebody else's work. We hope that that's not the case. But in any case, if your assignment goes above 35%, then it will not be graded. This is the rubric for this. A rubric is how I'm going to be marking this up. But I want to be clear about the fact that you are not going to be getting a grade for either your rough draft or your final draft. So it says here neither the rough draft nor the final draft will be graded. Instead, you will receive full credit for both assignments as long as they are 3 pages long and have a Turnitin similarity score of less than 35%. So as long as they're 3 pages, as long as they have less than 35% of a similarity score, then you're going to get full credit on both of those assignments, the full 40% on both of those. And so what this rubric does is it breaks down specifically what I'm going to be looking for in each one. So when you turn in your rough draft, I'm going to mark it according to these things. I'm going to say, well, you got a clear thesis. Well, that was good. The thesis was supported by quotes. That was satisfactory. You understand metaphorical language. I'll give that an unsatisfactory. Well organized, satisfactory, let's say MLA format, good, and free of grammatical errors, good. You would have different categories in here, right, for your rough draft, and that would tell you what specifically you need to do when you create your final draft. If you only got a good or a satisfactory in there, you're like, well, I need to improve that, right? If you got an unsatisfactory someplace, you really need to do some improvement on that. And so this is just a guide to tell you what to do as you move from your rough draft to your final draft. When you do your final draft, I'm going to mark this up, and what I'm going to expect to see is some kind of improvement. I want to see things moving to the left here, over to the excellent side. And if I'm not seeing any movement, if your final draft looks pretty much the same as your rough draft, you're still going to get the full 40%, 40 points on that. However, you're not going to be able to get a good grade on your reflection, which is the final element of this. In the reflection, you're going to talk about what you did as you moved from the rough draft to the final draft. And so I want to see some kind of movement in there. I want to see that you've made some changes. And again, if I'm not seeing any movement, let's say if somebody turned in the exact same thing for their final draft as they turned in for their rough draft, well, I can't give you any credit for your reflection because there's nothing to reflect on. Right? You didn't do anything. A reflection is for you to think about the process. What did you do as you moved through this process? And if you didn't do anything as you moved through the process, I can't give you any credit for that. So you'd lose all the points for your reflection. And the more movement I see from the right-hand side to the left-hand side, the better this project gets as you move from your rough draft to the final draft, the better grade you can get on your reflection. Because again, what I want to see is some kind of change, some kind of movement, right? You don't need to end up in excellent over here by the end to get a good grade. You just have to do significantly better. If everything were unacceptable and then you ended up as everything ended up as satisfactory, I say that's pretty good. Okay, I would hope for the next project then everything would move from satisfactory to excellent. But the idea, as long as you're moving from the right-hand side of the rubric to the left-hand side of the rubric, then what you're doing is going to be making some sense. So that is the overview of what we're doing for writing project number 1. Again, the first stage will be the outline. You've got a folder there that talks about the outline. And explain specifically what you're supposed to be doing for an outline. Go ahead and watch the video in there, create the outline. Because again, we're building this up slowly in stages, so you don't have to just jump in and suddenly write the essay. You're going to do the outline. I'm going to comment on that. Then you're going to create your rough draft. Then I'm going to comment on that. And then you're going to create the final draft and comment on that. So that's in general how this is going to be working. So you can go ahead and begin working on the brainstorming and outline.